that. But the more I thought about that, the more that struck me as quite implausible across time. Charles Taylor, I think it was Charles Taylor, wrote an interesting book called I think it was called The Origins of the Modern Self. He's a McGill philosopher, and I wouldn't necessarily call him a friend of classic religion, but it doesn't matter. He made a very interesting point about Christianity in particular. He said, well, if you're going to invent a religion that offered you nothing but infantile comfort, why in the world would you bother with conceptualizing hell? That just seems like an unnecessary detail to add to the whole story, right? If it's all about comfort, why would you hypothesize that the consequence of serious error was eternal torment? That doesn't really sound very, it isn't the sort of thing that is likely to make you feel comfortable. James Joyce, when he wrote about that, said he had terrible nightmares when he was a child because of the hellfire sermons the Jesuits used to spew forth, let's say. And he wrote down what he remembered of them, and they were pretty hair-raising. I think in James Joyce's book, I think it was Portrait of the Artist of a Young Man, he talked about the Jesuits telling him that hell was like a prison with walls that were 7 miles thick, that was always in darkness and consumed by fire, and that the people who were trapped there were continually burnt by this dark fire that gave new light, which also simultaneously rejuvenated their flesh so that it could be burnt off eternally. In case you were wondering how it was going to be burnt off eternally, that's apparently the process. It's not easy for me to see that as an infantile wish fulfillment, I'm afraid. Now, you could be a cynic about it, and Elaine Pagels, who wrote a book on the devil, was cynical about it in this manner. She thought that the Christians, so to speak, invented hell as a place to put their enemies. And, you know, yeah, fair enough, but no, that's not accurate, really, although it's convenient to have a place to put your enemies. Charles Taylor did point out, for example, that the modern terror of loss of self, let's say the existential loss of self and loss of meaning, was perhaps roughly paralleled by the medieval terror of hell, you know, in terms of existential intensity. And so hell wasn't merely a place where those people that you didn't care for would end up. It was the place where you were going to go if you didn't walk the line properly. And so I don't think Freud's critique really holds water in the final analysis. And then Marx's critique, of course, was that religion was the opiate of the masses, and he made an argument that was similar to Freud's, although somewhat earlier, and based upon the presupposition that religious beliefs were stories told to the gullible masses in order to keep them pacified and happy while their corporate overlords, for lack of a better purpose, continued to exploit them and weaken them. And, you know, I find the critique of human institutions as driven entirely by power very, let's say, questionable to say the least. And of course, every human institution is corrupt for one reason or another, and it's also corrupt specifically by such things as deception and arrogance and the demand for unearned power. And the same thing, of course, can be applied to religious systems, but that doesn't mean that they are in some special way characteristic of those faults. And maybe you think they are, and you know, maybe you can make a case for it, but it's not prima facie, I think that's how you say that, evident that also is a particularly useful criticism. I don't buy it. I think that's far too cynical. I think that the people who wrote these stories, first of all, what are you going to do? You're going to run a bloody conspiracy for 3,000 years successfully? It's like, good luck with that. You can't run a conspiracy for 15 minutes without somebody ratting you out. You know, it's impossible. So whatever's at the basis of the construction, not only of these stories, but of the dogmatic structures that emerged from them, I think that it's a terrible mistake to reduce them to unidimensional explanations. In fact, I generally think that reducing any complex human behavior to a unidimensional explanation is often the sign of a seriously limited thinker. And you know, I say that with some caution because Freud did do that with religion, at least to some degree, and Freud was a serious thinker, and Marx, I suppose, was a serious thinker too, even though, well, Yeah, he's someone you just, if you have any sense, Marx just leaves you speechless. So anyway, so that's all to say that I don't think there's any simple explanation for how these stories have the power that they have. I really don't. I don't think you can reduce it to political conspiracy, that's for sure. I don't think you can reduce it to psychological infantilism. I think you can make a case, like I have, that they are repositories of the collective wisdom of the human race. I had an interesting letter this week from someone. I get a lot of interesting letters. I think I'm going to make an archive out of them and put them on the web at some point, with people's permission, obviously. And he said that he'd been following my lectures and noted that I had been making what you might describe as a quasi-biological or evolutionary case for the emergence of the information that the stories contain. And he said, well, how do you know that someone from a different religious tradition, or speaking of a different religious tradition, couldn't do exactly the same thing? And I thought, well, first of all, to some degree they could, because there is overlap. Like, I've talked to you a little bit about Taoism, for example, in the Taoist view of being as, you know, the eternal balance between chaos and order.